Gas fitter exam cram session, video 7. Okay, so T downstream of the medium pressure regulator. Okay. Let's see. So next question is question 20. Fuel gas piping for other than dry gas conditions. In other words, we're talking about wet gas. We don't use wet gas anymore, but let's say we do. Shall be sloped not less than 1/4 inch in every 15 feet to prevent traps. So every 15 feet of travel, you're going to slope it, you're going to pitch it 1/4 of an inch. Why? Wet gas is wet. It's got moisture in it. This moisture will collect. You're going to give it a way to drip down to where? Oh, our drip legs. That's why we don't use the drip legs anymore, because dry gas doesn't have that problem. Okay, also, since we're talking about wet gas, can't use wet gas in outdoor situations. Let's say it falls below freezing. The moisture is going to freeze, produce a blockage in the pipe, no gas. Okay, question 21. Restrictions on the use of drip legs or dirt legs or sediment traps in gas piping systems are mainly to prevent unapproved connections. Okay, there are other reasons we covered before. We covered one just now if we're using wet gas for the condensate, but most importantly, they're trying to prevent unapproved connections. Gas is dangerous. Not everybody realizes that. The temptation to hook up an extra stove here or there or whatever, it's like, no problem. We'll unscrew the cap, throw on a valve on the fly. Boom, we got a stove, we got a new fixture. Not that simple, not that easy. You're inviting a lot of issues. So if there's no drip leg, if there's no nipple with a cap, that's just too tempting, because once again, what are we dealing with? Half a PSI or less? You can do that on the fly. If you're quick enough, your hands are steady enough, you can do it on the fly, no problem. What if you got a guy who isn't steady? What if something happens that you didn't expect? Anything is possible. Now you got a problem. Question 22. The specific gravity of natural gas for the purposes of the code is, okay, in the tables provided by the code, they're dealing with a specific gravity of gas. In other words, how heavy is this gas compared to air? Okay? The air in the atmosphere at sea level, we're going to say is 1. We established that as 1. So that any other gas that we're going to be dealing with, we compare it to 1. Is it lighter than air or heavier than air? This makes a difference. The specific gravity of natural gas, as listed in the code, the specific gravity they're going to use for their calculations is 0.60, 0.60. So it's lighter than air. Air is 1 at sea level. Natural gas is lighter than air. So natural gas will float. Interesting note to this one. Since natural gas will float, the best thing to do if you suspect a gas leak and you're in that area and you're not exactly sure how bad things are, you might want to stay low, because the gas is going to form a cloud that's floating high. If it ignites and boom, if you're low, stand a better chance of being able to tell people, oh, do you know what happened to me at work today? Instead of, oh, can you imagine? He went off for work and I didn't think that was the last time I'd ever see him again. See, 2 completely different conversations. Question 23. The specific gravity of the air we breathe for the purposes of everyone is 1. Okay? 1 sets the standard. We compare everything else to that standard. It gives us an idea. Is it heavier, lighter than air? Question 24. Gas meter and service piping are covered in Appendix E of the New York City Fuel Gas Code. This is an actual question. So, it's not enough to know the code. You need to know your way around the code. Okay? Like I said, there's not a lot. After a while, you're going to run out of questions to ask. So, they'll start getting a little pedantic. In other words, they'll start nitpicking, making a big deal about details that, well, let's face it. As I mentioned before, I think in the introduction, this test is just something you gotta do. You already know how to do this work. You've been doing this work, okay? It is is knowing that Appendix E has this information for the gas meter and service piping, especially when that's not even our domain. Going to improve your ability to run a riser without a leak, because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing. Did you run it without a leak, right? Is it going to hold? You know, it's like, can we get out of here to the next job? Can we make our money? And that's it, right? But nevertheless, if you want to know anything about gas meters or the service piping as far as the New York City Fuel Gas Code is concerned, it's going to be Appendix E. There is another appendix I gave you. So, we always want to find quick and easy ways to remember, because this is a very boring detail to remember. So how are we going to make sure that we remember it? Well, we're not going to worry about the other appendix I gave you. Appendix E, right, is for meter piping, correct? Appendix E for meter. E for meter, right? Now you won't forget. Appendix E for meter. 25. Gas distribution pressures over half a psi, but not over 5 psi, may be utilized within a commercial or industrial building when the boiler room requirements exceeds how many cubic feet per hour? And that's how we're going to measure gas. We're going to measure its consumption in cubic feet per hour, okay? 4,000. All right, so that's a lot of wordage. Let's look at the most important things, though. What did I say? I said that we're going to be allowed half a psi max. That was the blanket statement. In any building, that's as much as we're allowed. Okay, but then I did say, when we're dealing with the code, there's always going to be exceptions, right? So, in here, if we want to go over half a psi, but we're not going over 5 psi, so that's that next level after half a psi. Remember when we were dealing with the testing pressures, we had half a psi and then over half a psi, but our cutoff was 5 psi. And what was the testing pressure for that? That 5 psi should trigger our memory to say, oh, it's going to be 50 psi. And that was the main thing, because nothing else changed, because the time was going to stay at 30. But then after that, we realized, oh, no, the party's over. Anything after that, we're dealing with a full hour. And that an hour is pretty much standard across the code, because once again, we mentioned something about a steak dinner we had to get to, right? Okay. So, gas distribution pressures over half a psi, but not over 5 psi, may be utilized within a commercial or industrial building. Okay, we say commercial industrial building, so this is not a residential building. Okay, residential building should not be requiring this much pressure for gas. So the commercial or industrial building, I can imagine, let's say we're doing a, I don't know, UPS packaging facility or distribution facility. So you have huge open bays with conveyor belts and trucks loading. You don't want it to get too cold in there. So you're going to have ginormous space heaters hanging from the ceiling, being fed to, keep things from freezing for the workers and the packaging. That's going to require a lot of gas. In that instance, an exception is made. Yeah, and also for in here, when the boiler room requirement exceeds 4,000 cubic feet per hour. So 4,000 cubic feet per hour is not your little tiny boiler in the basement of your house. That's one exception. Remember 4,000. There's really no trick I can give you for that one, except that, well, that's the number, and that's pretty much where it appears, 4,000. It's the exception. If you're going commercial, industrial, boiler room requirements, over half a PSI, 4,000. Just something you got to know cold. All right, question 26. Gas distribution pressures as high as 15 PSI. And what did we say? As high as 15 PSI means that's high pressure gas. May be used for boiler requirements in excess of 100,000 cubic feet per hour. Okay, now, this number here, as opposed to the previous number, is a number that repeats itself. So this one is easy to remember because 100,000 shows up a lot. It's usually the limit. Okay, you're going to see when we're talking about other things like what constitutes a minor alteration or repair as opposed to a full-blown new work that requires a permit. We got cutoffs. A lot of times the cutoff is 100,000. Okay, you see that number? That's a good number to pick if you're not sure. 100,000 is a good guess. And here it's the exact answer. If we're going to go as high as 15 PSI for boiler equipment, that boiler equipment has to be over 100 cubic feet per hour. 100,000 cubic feet per hour consumption. Question 27. All gas piping operating at pressures over 5 PSI shall be welded. Okay, this is a very important question. This is where a lot of confusion comes, and understandably so, because the section of the code that deals with cutoffs for what is the largest threaded fitting you can use, what is the size where you have to start welding piping, at what pressures is everything welded regardless. The way it's phrased in the code, the way they list it out, you're going to see is it almost seems as if one is contradicting the other, but it's not. You have to read it very carefully. You have to be patient, keep track of it. So, once again, this is one of the reasons why I say 2 months is really the best for preparing for this exam, because it's not hard. It's not hard to learn the cutoffs and the pressures and everything. What is hard to learn is to get it in your head so that you don't have to constantly rethink or reinvent the wheel every time you say, okay, wait a minute, 5 PSI, I can do this, that, and it also gives you a better advantage with the questions on the exam, because the exam is, once again, they're going to go ask it this way or that way. It's the same question, but they ask it one way, they ask it another way. It can get very confusing. It's very easy to make a mistake when on the job you would know. Don't touch that threaded fitting. You should send it back because on this particular job at this pressure, we're never going to need it. On the job you would know. On the test, no. So, this blanket statement helps, okay? Because now we know, just like as we knew that 8-inch pipe gets purged no matter what, we're going to know that anything over 5 PSI gets welded, okay? So, over 5 PSI is welded. And that's it, regardless, okay? So you're asking, all right, what about pressures under? And it's like, how about we handle that later when we get to it because, like I said, it can get very confusing. We'll take it baby steps. Remember this, very important. Keep that in mind. Then we'll worry about the others because there's a little bit detail here, detail there. You get this one down cold that you never, you can see it every time, recognize it every time, not stand there thinking like, oh, okay, this one was that one was a bit. No. Anything over 5 psi, welded. We'll keep it simple, and then we'll add to it. And I guess we have no choice because question 28 is asking us, what about the next step below it? Gas distribution piping operating at pressures over 0.5 psi. So now we're talking about not the gas to the stove. Over 0.5 psi to 5 psi. To 5 psi is the same as saying 5 psi is included. Okay? Anything over was welded. But what about if we got 5? Or anything underneath, but not a half? Shall be welded if over 3.5 inches. Okay? This is where people start wondering, like, they start asking, like, wait a minute, that can't be right because it says this here, that there. It gets confusing. So, the next level below 5 psi was over 1/2 to 5 psi. Okay? All right, we will have 5 psi or anything less, but over half. Okay? We will be welding. All right? What will we be welding? We'll be welding 4-inch. We start welding at 4-inch. Okay? We're not going to be allowed a 4-inch threaded fitting if we're in this pressure zone. Okay? If it's over 0.5 psi to 5 psi, you got a 4-inch fitting, you gotta weld it. If you get, if they sent you threaded fittings for 4-inch, send it back. You won't be using it. You need welded fittings. Now, I just said that in this pressure zone, we're welding at 4 inches. That's a question. It can be phrased like that. But that's not what this question says. And, like I said, if you only remember it one way, if you only remember a question with, they're talking about the glass half full, and you don't practice all the different ways this question can be asked, so now you see the same question, it's asking the same thing, something that you know, but it's asking it in terms of they're coming at you like with the glass half empty. You're going to be thrown off. You could possibly get the wrong answer when you know what the right answer is, but not when you've never seen it before, not when you weren't prepared that it could be asked that way. If you keep going with how it's phrased in the code book, where the code book specifically says sizes 4-inch and larger shall be welded, good for you, you'll get that answer correct. But if you hit this question where it's asking you anything over what size is going to be welded, you got to think for a minute because your instinct is to hit 4, and most of the time that, you'd be right, except that it's not asking you at which fitting do you start welding. It asks you over what size fitting. Well, if we're welding at 4 inches, the next commercially available size below 4 is 3.5. The answer is 3.5. When everyone's starting out, this is the question that throws them off because this is meant to trick you. This is meant to get you used to constantly reinterpreting or, like we said, semantics, just flipping the words around ever so slightly to say something a little different, but technically it's the same, and then you say, oh, that's not fair, or the code says this or whatever, and they'll look at you and they'll smile and say, no. Is it wrong? It's not wrong. They're not lying to you. They're not deceiving you. You know, it's like it's up to you to be flexible. It's up to you to master the language of the code and to prepare yourself for any possible deviations. So, question 28, very important because this is using the phrasing of the question to try and mislead you. Gas distribution piping operating at pressures over half a psi to 5 psi, that includes 5 psi, shall be welded if over 3.5 inches. Okay, so that means if we have a 3.5 inch elbow threaded, we can use it. But if we're going to go to 4 inch, we got to break out the welded fitting. Okay. Question 29. Let's see. Question 29 will help cement, and question 29 is more in keeping with the actual wording of the code. 4 inch threaded piping, and of course it's going to include the fittings, the pipe itself, any valves, etc. May only be used for gas distribution pressures no greater than half a psi. So, what is the next level below this? And the starting level, well, we got up to half a psi. What is the largest fitting we can use in there? We can use a 4 inch fitting. 4 inch IPS. Iron pipe size, or just plain old, it means it's a threaded fitting. So, 4 inch IPS you can use in a half psi system. Now, what does that mean now? Well, it means if we got 5 inch piping, fittings, etc., it's going to have to be welded. Okay? Let's see. This is also a good question too, because in these 3 pressure zones, we've established that there is a different cutoff to where we can go with threaded piping and where we can go with welded. In a half psi, we can go with a 4 inch threaded fitting. We got to weld after that. The next level up, over half a psi to 5 psi, we must weld that 4 inch fitting. Okay? But that means we can use a 3.5 inch threaded fitting. And then if we go over 5 psi, okay, everything's got to be welded. So now you can get 2 questions because of this. All right. The first question comes directly from what we just covered. In over half a psi to 5 psi, can you use a 4 inch threaded fitting? No. Okay, a 4 inch any 4 inch must be welded. But you can also ask the blanket question, which will throw you off. Okay, what is the largest threaded fitting you can use in a gas distribution system? Notice the question, and you will get it. It has been on the exam. The question does not give you any contingencies. It doesn't say, oh, this pressure, that pressure. It just says, it's a blanket statement for, in a gas distribution system, what's the largest thread fitting you can use? You don't want to overthink it. For these tests, yes, we're training our minds to be sharper, faster, smart. If that equates to smarter, sure, fine. We're training it to be smarter. We're training to handle this. We're training to think, to spot areas where we could be tricked, to get used to language, improve our reading comprehension in that we read exactly what's there, not what we want to see or what isn't there because we accidentally saw something that's not there or interpreted the wording differently. Once again, that also takes time. 2 months, all of this takes time for your just for your body to acclimate to this. So we don't want to, we're going to always pay attention, always be aware, always keep our wits about us, but we're also not going to overthink it. That's the main thing I wanted to bring out, overthinking. It is possible with these exams. I do it a lot. I would say half of my mistakes throughout my time of taking these exams, I would say half is I just had no idea. Okay? I needed to know more. The other half would be I overthought it. I put more into the question, and not putting enough into the question is a mistake. Putting too much into the question is just as bad as a mistake, and neither one is good. It's like they both end up in the wrong answer, and at the end of the day, all wrong answers are equal. They're all wrong. You didn't get a point for it. An answer you got because you knew the whole thing and worked it out perfectly and got the right answer, that's awesome. You should do that. But at the same time, we always want to keep a healthy perspective. Then let's face it, the guy next to us, if he guessed it and got it right, it's just as equal as our answer, because a right answer is still worth the same amount of points no matter how you got it. You know? All these things you keep in mind, so you put just the right amount of effort into this. All right? But like I said, you can overthink this. And for that blanket question, that question it asks, what is the largest threaded fitting, the largest IPS fitting you can use in a gas distribution system? That question did not mention any of this. So, since it didn't mention this, then technically we could be talking about this. It didn't say we weren't talking about it. So, technically we could be talking about the system where we would be allowed a 4-inch threaded fitting, and that would be the correct answer. Okay, question 30. Carbon steel and wrought iron gas piping shall be at least standard weight. A lot in this, okay? First of all, we right off the bat, the only material we're allowed is black pipe. Black pipe is what? Black pipe is carbon steel pipe. It's got a little black coating for corrosion protection, but it's steel. It's steel pipe. Steel is iron mixed with carbon to a certain degree so that it's more resilient than iron. It's not as brittle, it doesn't crack. Wrought iron pipe. Okay. Wrought iron pipe. There is such a thing. It's still in the code. This is not going to be on the exam, but it helps if you kind of know this. Wrought iron pipe, we don't use this anymore. Wrought iron pipe, way, way old-fashioned, okay? You know, we're talking about the days before color photography and stuff like that. Wrought iron pipe is iron piping, but once we came out with power threaders, we came out with threading machines that worked off that used electricity, power threading, that required high-speed steel dies, wrought iron piping couldn't stand up to that. Okay, so wrought iron piping, they might still make it somewhere, I don't know, but we don't use it. You probably have never touched it. Okay, it just, once power threaders came out, once high-speed steel dies came out, the wrought iron pipe it wouldn't stand up to it. Wrought iron pipe was meant for strictly hand threading. We switched to carbon steel. That's pretty much what you've been dealing with. So, carbon steel, wrought iron gas pipe, same thing, but like I said, wrought iron piping is, it's just not around anymore. We don't use it. We use carbon steel. Now, the schedules. You would love to say Schedule 40. Maybe you're used to describing it as a schedule. Me too. But for the sake of the code, they're not talking schedule. Now, what standard weight? Yes. You want to say Schedule 40? Yes, it's Schedule 40 pipe. But it doesn't say Schedule 40 in the code. It says standard weight. Okay? You don't pay attention to code. You don't look at every line. You don't accept the fact that this test is their test and your ego has nothing to do with it. Your ego is one of the things you can put in that locker or leave at home or leave in the car before you go into the test room. It's their test, their house, their rules. They want it to be standard weight. You want to say Schedule 40, and in a test like this, if you didn't prepare yourself, if you